critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and the crusade against American history is toxic propaganda.
But some people think that if you name it, you can claim it. When that happens, don't get caught in the middle.
Exactly what are we talking about?
Frequently, the definition and effects of racism are greatly misunderstood.
In 1966, that is going to stop.
Well, my theory was, I wrote the paper in 1969. I wrote a paper called The Crest Theory of Color Confrontation and Racism. And the sole reason behind writing that paper was an attempt to understand the behavior of white people in relationship to all people of color, every place in the world, black, brown, red, and yellow people. And the paper was presented to the Americans at the National Medical Association, the section on psychiatry, in neurology, because back in 1969, the Black Caucus in the American Psychiatric Association, we had said that racism, and when we talk about racism, we're talking about the white supremacy behavior of white people, that racism was the #1 mental health problem in the nation, and it was the #1 cause of other mental health problems. And I wanted to understand what this thing of racism really is all about, because it's the thing that has caused woe and misery and suffering for the vast majority of the people on this planet that are classified as non-white. And in my attempt to understand why the necessity of white people to keep saying that white is superior and that the condition of non-white is inferior, and the more I thought about it, in conjunction with an idea that a friend of mine had, that racism was a worldwide behavioral system for the maintenance of white supremacy by a small minority of people, I put those ideas together with what we know about genetics, what we know about the condition of skin whiteness itself. And so unless white people control the reproductivity of people of color, then we can postulate that perhaps one day there won't be any white people. And I think that the very survival of white people necessitates that they project genetic inferiority on people of color, because it is they who really are aware that they are genetic recessive and perhaps genetically inferior to people of color. And I am not saying this to call the condition of skin whiteness to say, well, no, white people are inferior. I'm not saying it for that purpose, but I think that it is of prime importance for the majority of people in the world to understand why it is that white people have to, the effective majority, large numbers of white people, have to move in a hostile and an aggressive way against people of color, and have to constantly focus on it's you who's genetically inferior, because they realize that there's something wrong with their genetic status. Now,
May I take a call?
Oh, sure,
All right.
please.
An operational definition of individual racism is subordination of a person or group because of race. But we will focus on the institutional practice of racism, when a group is subordinated by factors indirectly related to race.
More than interesting proposition that America is institutionally racist.
Well, let me say that's a long question. Let me point out one aspect. It's a question that calls for a very long answer. I think I might just at this point say that in a time like 1 hour, we may expose a problem and encourage thinking about it, and this is a very valuable thing.
There is a class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they do not want to lose their jobs. There is a certain class of race problem solvers who don't want the patient to get well. That was said by Booker T. Washington.
And let me mention one thing, which is that in certain areas there is no doubt about black superiority. Blacks are superior.
It has been said before, but I will repeat it.
There is no doubt about black superiority, and they're superior in a systematic way. Now, I don't expect that people will understand the details of this, but I simply want to show that quantitative work can be done. This happens to be a research job of my own, and what it shows, because these points that you see here lie on a line, which is not the central line, but they lie systematically on a line. What it says is blacks are systematically better than whites It's as if their bell-shaped curve, their distribution curve, were pushed upwards compared to whites, such that it would mean that the average IQ distribution would be up by 9 points rather than down by about 15 points, which is the typical average.
I came to the conclusion that the dominant never cede power willingly.
Every bargain ain't a bargain.
An example would be a union with all white members. You can only get in the union if a member sponsors you, and automatically whites select one another. So this pattern of selection automatically keeps blacks out. The union is white in the first place because its membership reflects the leftover patterns of slavery. Therefore, racist behavior is both intentional and unintentional. Our institutions mostly involve unsuspecting individuals who are part of a racist pattern.
The basic assumption of this video is that if your grandparents are rich in the United States, this means that you are rich in the United States. And that if your grandparents are poor in the United States, that means that you are poor in the United States.
Get the white devil. Get the devil.
The biggest problem that we have in the United States right now is a historic wealth gap. We have is an income gap in the United States. And
get the white devil. I can give you a very good reason that this TV camera can pick this up. Here it is.
Income changes over time to wealthy.
My community is not a group of men that do drugs. It's not a group of men who taser police officers. It's not a group of men who assault police officers or don't want to listen to basic instructions.
Because of the seriousness of the condition that our people now find themselves in, that it's absolutely impossible to solve our problems with means other than religion, to stand on our own feet, and instead of trying to force ourselves upon whites or force ourselves into the white society or blame the white man for our predicament and constantly beg him for what he has, the only way that we can solve our problem is to unite together among ourselves, among our own kind, clean ourselves up, rid ourselves of the evils that we've become addicted to here in this society, and try and solve our problem ourselves.
Should we be put down and shot to death for this request? If so, you can aim your guns.
Or else I'll be dead.
I'm thinking about in terms of a better and a greater world for all people. And we can't do that by me in one corner doing what I can do to hurt you and you in the other corner doing the same thing against me.
We have businesses around the country that are patronized by whites, and we have many businesses here in Chicago, and our customers are white as well as our own kind.
There is no such thing as a race.
And a white person can go into any of these places of business, and he'll have to admit that he is treated with more respect, and he finds more dignity there than he will find among the so-called Negroes who profess to be teaching love for everyone.
Nature created no races.
Negro is a term that was applied to us during slavery by the slave master. And right today, it's a term that is used only to point out the descendant of slaves. It's never used for black people, period. Africans can come to this country. They aren't called Negroes. And if they are called Negroes, they resent it. So if Negro meant black, as we've been taught, it would be a term that would be applicable to or applicable to everyone. But he says that it is something that means a slave, or something who is, it means something that has been left out of society, politically, economically, educationally, and otherwise.
Man created races, racial classifications, and he had his own reason for doing it.
Think of it as an anthropological term.
Definitely. It's not an anthropological term, it's a slave term. And it was a term that was invented in America and was used by the slave makers, slave traders, and slave masters, and attached to the property or the chattel or merchandise that our people represented in that particular day.
Mr. O'Connor.
Now, who benefited from this artificial creation at first? Who benefits from it now? Now,
we're trying to gain acceptance. So the idea was to imitate the black. I mean, whatever you want it to be. You want to be a black businessman?
So you spoke as the black businessman would speak, and you would dress as he dressed with the three-piece suits, and you would act that way to gain acceptance, you see, and you would talk, so forth and so on, and you wore an Ivy League haircut the same way that he did, and so forth and so on.
Well, coming into the late 50s and the 60s and finding out that we're so disillusioned by what is happening, because prejudice and racism, of course, it does not exist in all white people, but there's enough that kicks everybody in the backside so that you know that there are enough people who are against you because you are black, that you become paranoid, which is not an evil word to say, because there are white people who are paranoid.
And it's just shocking. I mean, it's shocking how many war crimes were committed on camera. And it's just amazing the propaganda that's just told to us about what this is and why they have the right to kill people that pose no threat to them.
And I think I don't think we've gone over it too well.
This is the streets talking for themselves. They don't need me right now.
Shit, many fans as I got. Could be anybody. Could be Bambi, or Conchita, Monique, Jaja, Shaniqua.
Well, what luck? There's a note.
Could you read it to me? Quit playing. Come on, read it.
Okay. Well, hey, you can read it to some big man. It is kind of pathetic when a man's wife got to read him his little love notes. Look, just remember now, Jaja, that begins with a Z. Now, if that is from a woman, I suggest you put it in the sink before opening it.
Or do we need to address criminality altogether? Should it be the criminals that get into trouble? Should we stop protesting on behalf of criminals that get into trouble?
Well, we love America. But you are driving us back and you are making a Samson out of us, and we are going to pull down the pillars.
It should not be particularly surprising.
To Black America, what is it that we want?
Let me begin by suggesting that the clearest evidence of racism in education is the essential control over black education, both in so-called integrated settings and in segregated settings by white people, many of whom are incapable of responding to the people they're educating as people, many of whom are incapable of understanding the culture and the history of the people they're educating, many of whom really do not see any kind of responsibility for involving these communities and managing their own education. They may not be able to respect as people.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities.
So let's talk for a second about school policy. The reality is that if you wanted Jamal to be able to go to Kevin's school, what you'd want is something called school vouchers. You want people to be able to move away from their school districts. One of the chief reasons that Jamal is confined to his local public school is because of democratic policy that has decided that you must go to school in the district where you live. And this is also why a lot of people have left lower income areas and moved out to higher income areas specifically for better public schools. So if you want Jamal to have the same educational opportunities as Kevin, perhaps you should have school vouchers for private schools, or perhaps you should have charter schools, which is what Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York is fighting against, or perhaps you should break the teachers unions, which are costing a fortune, particularly on a disproportionate level in areas where they're not spending enough taxpayer dollars. So I'm all for improving Jamal's schools. I'm also all for Jamal having all the same educational opportunities as Kevin. The problem is most Democrats are not.
Let me put it to you this way. We are proud of being black and of our black heritage, but white America does not accept the concept that this is a multiracial society. It has never accepted the fact that there are black people, brown people, yellow people here alongside them. They've always looked upon America as being white, and hence all of its propaganda is directed at us to convince us that somehow or the other we must become white before they will accept us.
Many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race.
Why is it that black people don't own the land where they live? White people own that land. We've never been taught property values. You see, we've never been taught property values. I don't own Harlem, for example. Black people don't own Harlem. So who gives a damn whether Harlem burned down or not? How you gonna tell me to love this property that exploits me every day when the average black man in Harlem works the first Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday for a landlord?
Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias.
Not only have whites tried to deceive blacks about the realities, but they, in effect, deceived each other about the realities. That is, I'm sitting here thinking about the institutions in society, all of which are racist, you know, which whites created and which whites have used in order to advance themselves, but never at any point stopping and recognizing, for instance, that the prisons have nothing to do with rehabilitation, or that the courts, in most cases, really have nothing to do with justice.
Redlining became illegal in the United States as early as 1968. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act was followed by the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act in 1975, which was a predecessor to the Community Reinvestment Act, both of which were an attempt to ensure that people who were living in low-income minority neighborhoods could actually get loans. And these things were very effective. In 1992, researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston tried to look at the data. They collected information on some 30 variables related to lending decisions. They found that virtually all of the difference between minority and non-minority denial rates was explained by those variables. A reanalysis of that information found that black-owned banks were actually lending to white-owned businesses at higher rates than they were lending to black-owned businesses. Furthermore, if it seemed that banks were discriminating against black borrowers on the basis of they needed to have higher credit qualifications, what you would see is lower default rates from black clients of banks, from people who are borrowing money from banks in the black community. There are zero studies that show any of this. So the bottom line is this. Redlining was an evil and awful policy. It was made illegal in the 1960s. By the 1980s, the banks were not lending at disproportionate rates. In fact, if you look at among different communities, as Thomas Sowell has pointed out, Asian Americans get loans more easily than white Americans. That does not mean the banks are being racist toward white Americans on behalf of Asian Americans. When it comes to college education, it is also worth noting that, yes, there were many universities that were segregated. There were many universities that did not allow black people to attend. Since the 1970s, the most prominent measure that has been used in order to admit black students to major universities across the country has been affirmative action, which actively discriminates against people who are not black in favor of black applicants, specifically by ensuring that black applicants don't have to have the same test scores or GPAs in order to get into those same schools. So not only has policy been corrected, it's been overcorrected in these areas.
What about schools? What specifically is a racist pattern, in your opinion, as far as the educational process or the schools is concerned?
Well, I would say that the overwhelming educational process that is racist is a tendency to educate people against their own interests. That is, to educate black kids to hate themselves, to educate blacks to feel alienated from their own people, to educate blacks to become advocates for the mainstream against their own community.
Well, how is that done, specifically?
Well, I would say that, you know, the traditional educational process is, number one, the concealing of the truth about history, the educating of black students away from the problems of their own community. For instance, very few black students on college campuses are enabled to use their minds to work on the problems that bedevil the black community, like sickle cell anemia, or the housing problems, the drug problem, problems that are imposed on the black community by the outside. Very few black students on white campuses or any campus are spending their energies and their minds on trying to find solutions to those problems. In most cases, they're being educated, say, with a drug problem to learn how to use methadone. You know.
These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
Now, the role of institutions in a society is to reflect the power that controls that society. So we have American institutions arrayed against us, and we naively expect these institutions to reform themselves, because if they reform themselves, that's tantamount to presiding over their own demise.
Yeah, I've observed that myself. I of course, would put a different coloration on it than the other side.
Yeah, since there's a need for brevity, I'll make my question as short as possible. If one does an historical analysis of the situation as it exists in the world at present, there's an increasing tendency on the part of third world countries to gravitate towards the socialist ideal, whatever it may be. And I'd like both sides of the fence to address the question as to why this is so. Is it an ineptness on the part of radicals and intellectuals, or is it a clear analysis of historical perspectives?
Mixed up mind. If we could understand that black psychology is the psychology that the black man has to have if he's going to escape from powerlessness in a white man's world. Now, the struggle is a struggle between black people for power and white people to keep power. Now, all we're dealing with is a power struggle. Every institution that the white man has, he uses in this power struggle. There's nothing wrong with that, nothing immoral about it. Any people would do that. When we get on top, we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to use every institution to perpetuate black power. And the white man's going to have to fight up from the bottom again for another, 100 million years trying to get back to a position of power. There's nothing wrong with fighting for power, but the thing that's wrong is for powerless people to accept their powerlessness and to accept the definition by which they are maintained powerless and to accept the institutions which perpetuate their powerlessness. So that's why I think the black church has to become a power base for black people in changing this total institutional conception structure that black people are living in. We've got to use it as a base to spin off all the institutions that black people need that come from a black perspective, a black orientation, and are concerned with black power.